to...
Yeah.
Okay, so I don't have a picture of the brain on my cover. So this is the department I work in, and this is a big church in York. It's famous, I believe. Okay, so basically, I actually moved this slide to the front because it was essentially the thing that was interesting about Daniel's talk was just that basically I think I have never seen a talk which was like the same idea as I've been working on for so long, but starting from a different approach. So when this is Richard Feynman, who's a physicist, and this is from a book he wrote. What he's really doing is describing a problem that physics faced a long time ago, where he essentially was saying, imagine being at a beach where you've got like the sea and pebbles and the sky. It's very eloquently written. But the point he's making is that if you wanted to have an explanation for the things that you can see at the beach, an intuitive way to do it would be to say, okay, so basically there are stones. So we're going to propose a thing called stoneness. That's a property of stones. And there would be another thing called water, so it would have the property of waterness. And you could basically come up with a one-to-one mapping between properties and phenomena. Okay? And then the problem is that really is fine, except it's not an explanation, because you still have just as many things as you started out with. So what physics managed to do was solve this in a different way. It ended up with like quarks and things like that, which there are quite a lot of, but they produce many, many more things than there are quarks and atoms and so on and so forth. At a certain point when I was doing research on the topic of spontaneous thought and its brain basis, I think I worked out that this would be the only sensible way to go forward for all kinds of different reasons that hopefully will become clear as I progress in my talk. So I just wanted to start off by saying that I'm really lucky because these people, you can't really see Daniel, he's wearing my hat and my sunglasses. So I met Daniel when I worked at the NPI in Leipzig, probably almost 5 years ago. And basically he was the best thing that happened to me in Leipzig, for sure.
Oh, shucks.
And then you can see here a picture of Beth Jeffries, who I run a group with at York, which is probably the best things happened to me since I went to York. So, and the thing is, they're just like awesome because the work I'm going to show today has been contributed by all kinds of different people, but these two people have conceptually led me to the conclusions that I've had. And the reason why that I believe is the case is because, well, first of all, they're awesome. Second of all, they're really, really clever. And clever in ways that I certainly am not. They're much more detailed, for example, than I am. So I do a lot of hand waving. I make reverse inferences routinely as a job. But the main reason why it's like really nice to collaborate with these people is because I think this is how I conceive of the problem I'm trying to understand. So I think that a huge part of the human condition is the occurrence of states. Okay? But the problem is that what we want to do as scientists is understand processes. So this is a picture from a very famous book that I remember reading briefly as an undergraduate student, where Jerry Fodger basically summarizes the evidence that existed at that point in time for there being small units that do little things in the brain. And I remember reading this book, it wasn't very big, and at the end, I just remember getting to the end of it, and it said, but the funny thing is that we don't really understand how the processes interact. And obviously, that's basically the big problem, right? And I just thought, well, that was really cool, because that seemed like the most interesting part. He was basically openly saying, no idea how you solve that. And that was pertinent to me because I think I was already understanding states for my PhD. So when I met Daniel, he showed me this picture, which I thought was like totally insane, and because it looks like a brain with like a patch of cloth over it in a messy way, and it didn't seem to be at all useful the first time I saw it. And in fact, when he started doing the little thing where he moves a bit of cortex and rotates it, I simply thought he'd gone mad. Actually, I thought this is the end of Daniel as a scientist, and I didn't say this out loud. This is what I thought, he's gone insane. But it transpires that he hadn't. And then the thing is, and then when I moved to York, Beth basically, by training as a neuropsychologist, and she'd done this really amazing work looking at people who have two types of semantic problems. One of them is people who have semantic dementia, so that's like an organic deficit. And what her research has shown is that they have lost the ability to have a concept. So they have this totally, well, it's not awesome for them, but it's a fascinating catalogue of problems. So if you're somebody with semantic dementia, you might have lost the concept of owl, for example. And if you get somebody to do a task that requires that concept to be used, they will fail in all the trials to do with owl, but not necessarily in the words to do with cat, for example. So it's a specific targeted lesion almost in a representational space. And then the other group of people that she worked with were people with semantic aphasia. Now, they are people for whom they've lost the ability to control semantic information. And that means that they can sometimes do tasks to do with owl, they can make associations with it, but under certain circumstances when the tasks get difficult, they struggle. And so that immediately was interesting to me because that is essentially very like the quote that I had from Feynman, in the sense that it implies that in order to be able to use conceptual information, you sometimes need to use a control process, which is perhaps what's happened when people have semantic aphasia, and also you need to have this kind of representational process that allows you to have the concept in the first place. And that's already like a component process architecture. So it was just amazing. And I didn't really go to York to work with Beth, and I didn't go to Leipzig to work with Daniel, but both of these people have been very influential in my thinking simply because they've allowed me to understand the whole of this problem, I think, much better than I would be able to do by myself. Because I was kind of stuck here, making grand hand-waving statements about like thought, right, which and mind wandering and all these kind of unconstrained and also unnecessarily vague processes. So the idea really is, in the work that I do at the moment, is it's trying to link all of this together. And I think that what I worked out was that the brain is really helpful because even if you are interested in the psychological state, you might want to build the models so that the processes explain the state, the brain gives you this common language. I think that was one of the things that Daniel was trying to explain in his talk, that you can think about this problem in all kinds of ways, but one way would be to say, let's start with the brain, at least in the sense that we can agree that there's a voxel here in a particular part of space, and we can talk about it, and that might mean, for example, that you could understand that maybe it does serve a very small modular process if you do the right experiment, but it might also contribute to a state that's much more broad and much richer, and it might be actually what the psychologists want to understand. So I remember one really proud moment I had when I was, Beth and me wrote well, we tried to write a grant, and the university wouldn't even let us submit it, which was quite stupid of them, right? But she said, we had to answer these questions, she said, the problem is, you see, that I've understood how people with semantic dementia use the word dog in association with the word bone. But of course they have problems in life, right? Not about that task. They can't do stuff that we can't understand that simply by looking at processes. And the stuff that I do, I guess, was more to do with the kind of things that people do in real life, really. But it's a much harder problem because it's much vaguer, right? And so you can kind of like see that, like, I think that the solution to understanding maybe these fascinating and complicated and rich states is through understanding in detailed processes and brain networks, and it's the combination of these two more specific and detailed methods that might allow us to have a less vague understanding of the things that might be more interesting to us as researchers of people, basically. Okay? Because we don't probably care so much about the Stroop task, right? The Stroop task is a thing that should help us understand states. It's not the other way around. Right? Okay, so I have to have this slide because this is, I'm unfortunately famous for having this word, or if I am famous, it's to do with it. And one of the points that I have here is this definition is not the same as the definition we wrote in paper in 2006 that started people doing it. And I've been constantly struggling because I still don't even like this definition very much. For example, when I met Mika, for example, I thought self-generated was a good term. I think that's a piss term now. So basically, all the terms I ever get, I end up thinking they're not very good, right? And my definitions have become increasingly vague, right? So that's the point, right? But anyway, it doesn't mean, by the way, that I don't think that there is a phenomenon that we want to understand. I guess the question is, are phenomena something you can describe and define? I don't really think they are anymore. Certainly not this one. But if I did want to describe it and get you to focus on what I think is interesting, you can do it schematically, right? So just imagine, this is my matrix, it's not like a matrix of brain correlations, okay? It's much simpler, right? Imagine that you're doing a really boring task, okay? Something to do with numbers, right? Because that's what I used to use as a target. And then what happens is, we are trying to get a handle on the types of states you could have in this kind of concept, right? So one state would be thinking about the numbers, right? But I use numbers because it's really boring, because really what I want people to do is to do something else. So they will occasionally think about the numbers, but then, for example, if their phone rang, they would be distracted by it, okay? Okay? They might also think, this is totally annoying. Why do I have to sit here? Well, obviously I know I'm going to get paid £10 or get course credits for participating in this experiment, right? And they might find that that's still not a good enough justification to sit and think about the numbers. But occasionally, and that's what's highlighted in this little red box, is they might do something that's much more interesting to me, which is generate thoughts that are nothing to do with the environment they're in, right? And the important point of this slide is we put it into an annual review I wrote this year, simply because we'd had about 5 years of arguing with people, okay, about whether mind wandering was a form of distraction. Now, I don't actually care about that in one sense, because I think it requires an assessment about what people should attend to. But even if you did think it was a form of distraction, it is different to this form of distraction. And that's simply because you do not have any reason to think about drinking cocktails on the beach based on the environment you're in. So even if we wanted to write it off as a type of distraction, it's quite a fascinating one, because it's not like something weird happening in the environment, we do it ourselves. And I think that's what drove my interest in this phenomenon right from the beginning. Because it seems like you might get insight into cognition by looking at states that don't occur because of the environment that would be different to the kind of inferences you'd make about how the mind works if you're constantly bombarding it with input. Okay? So the point of the slide is just to say that this and this, even if they are types of distraction, differ critically on where the distraction arises. And if I get distracted by my thoughts, I created my own distraction. Okay? And that's quite a different kind. So basically we know stuff about it. For example, if I make people do boring tasks that are easier than another set of tasks that are also boring but hard, people spend more time mind wandering or being off task. So this slide I was going to put in for a different reason, but I'm going to talk about it differently now because of Daniel's talk. So if you remember, I was just saying how crap my definition was. So I think that I kind of focused on that maybe 4 or 5 years ago when I was working in California as a postdoc. And for various reasons I don't need to go into, I started wondering whether there were patterns of covariance amongst the questions you can ask people when you mind wander. It kind of started when Dan Schachter had been doing experiments about the default mode network and had discovered that people think about the future a lot and use the default mode network. He'd shown that when you think about the future, you use the default mode. And I was kind of like, I guess I wanted people like Dan Schachter to give a shit about what I did, right? So one day I just thought, I'm going to put these questions in, because they were getting all this press about mental time travel, and it kind of annoyed me because I'd been doing mental time travel experiments all the time, but I was always calling it task unrelated thought. And at a certain point somebody explained to me that was just a very boring way to think about it. So I thought, well, I'll just ask people, do you think about the future? And we found, for example, that people like to think about the future more in the past. And then when I started thinking that, I thought, well, what else do people think about? Okay, seems quite a reasonable inference. And then we did an experiment, and it transpired to be the case that people thought about the future more if I made them think about themselves. And in that particular experiment, what I did was I made them think about themselves, and then they did and then they did my boring task. So think about the self was in the past, but it increased thoughts about the future. And I couldn't understand why that would be, but it made me wonder whether there was like covariation in the way that people would answer the questions. So when I moved to Leipzig, we started doing experiments to ask that question. So all we really did was ask people all of these questions every time we interrupted them doing a boring task. Okay? And then we make a massive matrix out of them, and then I do, basically, like I'm not very good at maths or computers or anything like that, so we use SPSS, which I don't know if you've heard of. It's a statistics package you're taught about in the second year of psychology, or first year if you're lucky, and it's got a button called factor analysis. I knew that people did this with personality questions, so I did it, and we got this matrix. And actually what we did was we had 3 different data sets. So I tried lots of things, but this way I would always get the same matrix, which you can see here, right? What this matrix is basically the weightings of these questions with respect to each other. And so we get, for example, quite often, a factor to do with the future that weights heavily on the self, and another factor to do with the past that weights heavily on others. Now, to be honest, I don't know why, but it happens quite frequently. So it's quite robust. And actually, I've now moved to York, and at least in 2 of the day sets we ran there, we get the same pattern. It's quite astounding. We actually, the PhD student who did this, I could never explain to how remarkable I thought it was that if we did this thing, we got the same pattern. She just thought it was normal, because she was younger, I guess, and not so, she hadn't had things not replicated. But anyway, but the point is that this is like the alternative to defining what mind wandering is, right? Because the participants do it all. All we have to do is decide here, and then this structure emerges, and so I have this is like my way out of having to define anything anymore, right? And so, for example, we've sent one of my PhD students to Japan, and if we do this experiment there, we don't get quite the same pattern. I think this is brilliant, right? Because it's basically, I don't have to argue anymore about what it is I measure because it's got a number. The problem is, of course, I can't pin down what it is. So that led to me meeting Daniel and Beth and trying to come up with a model that would explain this that wasn't so lame, right? But the other thing we know that is part of the same story is that basically, whatever this thing I study is, it's really complicated with respect to how it relates to how people do in life. So these words here are just things that I or other people have shown are related to mind wandering. Right? So for example, people solve problems if they mind wander. They sometimes delay gratification, which is a good thing, and plan. So these are all under the rubric of creativity because they're useful. Like we would like to be able to solve problems and so on and so forth. On the other hand, people screw up tasks, sometimes are unhappy, and you can often show that they don't have very good control. And the problem is that how on earth can it be the case that one thing is both good and bad? So I think this is the same part of the problem. So the last slide showed that this one thing contains structure that's stable but different. And here, I think we're seeing that this thing has both good and bad outcomes. And so this just put me in a position where I was like, I got loads of citations, right, by arguing was it a good or a bad thing. But after all, I thought this is just stupid, right? We just don't have a model, really. If we had a model, we would solve it. But the reason that I guess that I'm here is because we also, at that point, had worked out, and Mika did this one, I think. So this is one we published in PNDS, and this is somebody else's data. But these all show that the default mode is on during these mind-wandering states, right? And this was important because suddenly I was like, maybe, because at the very least, this has got to be a more sophisticated measurement than the measurements I've already shown you, right? Maybe there's a way we can somehow solve this. And this is just a reverse inference analysis we did using Neosynth, which shows you if these parts of the brain come up, people have put into their papers these sorts of words. The bigger the letters, the more likely that word is put into the paper. So anyway, this shows that the reason I'm here probably talking about default mode is because it's involved in this state I'm trying to understand. So this is the default mode network. Now I'm sophisticated enough to make pictures of brains. So these are ones I made. This is actually data we collected at York. We had 87 people and we did functional connectivity from here. These are the shapes you get. I don't know what I'm going to say, but that's supposed to be next time. So then we have Feynman. And so the point is, I guess, that to flip back to this guy, there are at least 4 or 5 brain places that make this network. Okay? So it's perfect for the problem that Feynman's quote is supposed to solve. Because there's, this guy and this guy. For example, when I met Daniel, I also met somebody called Boris Bernhardt, and they were both people that knew about anatomy. And it really changed the way I thought about things, because basically, I was like, so this guy doesn't have the same connections as this guy. But routinely in experiments, they come on together. And that's just like weird, because it can't be that they're doing the same thing. Nobody would organize a brain so that 2 different parts, very far away, just redundantly do the same computation. There must be a difference between them. And then, for example, this is like Beth's favourite area, right? And this guy comes on if people make decisions about whether a dog goes with the word bone, right? This is not what we mind wander about, right? But at the same time as people are doing those experiments, they're also saying this is the mind-wandering network. And so there's a kind of really fascinating puzzle, and the Feynman quote under this context is important because all he wants to say here is that when you have a very heterogeneous phenomenon, like either the universe or mind-wandering, what you really want are a small number of things that, by the way they organize themselves, produce a complicated thing. Okay? And it's also awesome that one day I've now got to talk about a physicist, because when I wanted to be a physicist younger, I was a young physicist. So, how might this work? Well, this is all pictures of a computer game called Minecraft. Okay? So, you know what Lego is, right? So this is like Lego in the computer world, and probably Lego are angry that they didn't make this game, because they should have. It's like Lego, a computer game. But the point is that these are just pictures off the internet about what you can make with Minecraft. And what's awesome about that is that they did not sit down and say, here is one unit, which is called the spaceship, and here is another unit called the bridge, They just propose a very small subset of little things that through their combination produce big things. So this is just a very facetious way of explaining how I think you could explain all those problems I just talked about, which is that essentially there must be smaller units in the default mode network or the mind-wandering state, whichever way you want to think about it, that join together and produce experiences that we would all care about as people. So in Minecraft, for example, you can take wood and coal and make a torch, or you can take wood and stone and make a shovel. But the point is, wood is common to both. What's different about them is what you add to it. So just conceptually, it doesn't seem totally outrageous that some of the experiences that we would all put into the category of mind-wandering would be like the combination of like this thing, and other experiences might be the combination of the first thing and something else, right? I mean, this is like not a very complicated idea. I can't actually imagine it being wrong either. It seems like it must be true, right? Anyway, I get to argue with people about whether it is, which is another way to drive a citation up, I think. Anyway, so just guessing, right? This is what you might need to be able to do a mind-wandering episode. If I had to guess about a small number of components you would at least have to have. So the person is now sitting and thinking about cocktails on the beach. Now, in order for them to do that, they have to know something about the world. They have to know what beaches are, cocktails, and airplanes. That's all necessary for having that thought. They also have to have something like consciousness, which I'm not going to say I have an explanation for, but they are thinking about it consciously, because we would assume that when they aren't thinking about cocktails, airplanes, and beaches, they still know about those concepts. So they don't vanish when they aren't thinking about them. So this information here must be available when you aren't thinking about it. You can think about it under those circumstances. And then the final thing is, and this is probably a little bit related to the thing that Daniel mentioned, or at least that's one of our best guesses, is that they're doing this independently of the environment. So when we did a lot of experiments about mind-wandering at the beginning, at one point I thought, well, this is crap, I'm just asking people questions, I don't believe what they're saying. I need a way of validating it. So I thought, well, maybe they make mistakes on tasks, okay? And then they did. So that was like a massive tautology that led to quite a lot of citations. People who say they aren't thinking about a task aren't doing the task very well. That was a discovery. It shouldn't have been, but it was. But anyway, and then we had this massive argument in the literature because somebody said, it's because it's an executive failure. They can't control their attention. So we had a big to and fro trying to find evidence for and against this. And at one moment I thought to myself, you know what, look, I'm just going to pursue the most interesting interpretation of this, and I don't care about being right. There's one interpretation that's more interesting than all the other ones, and that is that if I'm going to think about something other than the environment, I cannot simultaneously do a dumb task. They compete with each other, and it's impossible for them to both be happening at the same time. So Daniel's distance idea, which proposes almost that the default mode network is far away from sensory information, if you think about this problem, could be the mechanistic explanation for it. It could be that the default mode network is so far away from sensory input that it can be independent. Okay? So that's the kind of the third part. Now obviously the point here is that I've also worked out that I am never in my life going to work out how many component processes there might be. But one can assume that there might be more than one and disprove the idea that there's only a single thing. Okay, so that's kind of the way I think about this problem now. Okay, so in the talk, I'm just going to take each of these kind of ideas with slightly different names because I'm inconsistent. This one's, I couldn't be bothered changing it from long-term memory to knowledge, but that could be knowledge, and this could be conscious representation, whatever that is. And independence could be the coupling idea. So one of the things that happened when I started hanging out with Beth at York and doing experiments with her was that we kind of hooked onto this really weird but cool thing, which is very, very similar to Daniel's distance idea actually. So then now Beth and me and Daniel work together on that problem. And that is that she's interested in this part of the brain which is called the anterior temporal lobe. Now, what's fascinating about that is here they believe sort of amodal representations of things are expressed. So this is something called the hub and spoke model. So basically the idea is that like, if you wanted to explain how people represent the concept of dog, then what happens is, here is like dogness, and then features of dogs would be represented some places, and the smell of a dog would be represented somewhere else. And what happens when you think about a dog is you kind of bring together all of this information. Okay? But what's interesting about that is, this guy here is therefore kind of invariant. Okay? in a way, in the sense that he is not related to any particular feature, because dogs can look different from each other, but we can still know that they're all a dog. Okay, and this is a bit like Wittgenstein's problem too, right? It's all to do with concepts. And this is one way you can have an input invariant representation. Okay? So it's something that's independent of perception, but it's not quite the way that I was describing the cocktails example, right? But there's a fascinating thing about it too, which is that these are also these representations, right? Like, we're not thinking about a specific cocktail necessarily. It's somehow to do with the concept of holidays. Okay, so there's a kind of relationship here I don't quite understand that links this capacity to be independent of the environment and for your cognitions to have this property, and this capacity to represent information that is amodal and is not tied to one particular input, one particular example of something. So that's just a kind of a thing I don't understand, as opposed to everything I've talked about, which I also don't understand either. But this is a cool one. But anyway, in terms of the one I do have more knowledge about, which is just this idea of perceptual decoupling, we've done lots of experiments to look at that now. At the beginning, because it was cheaper, we did ERPs, and you can basically show that when people are saying they're not paying attention, if you measure how much the brain responds to an input at that moment in time, it is smaller, okay? Immeasurably smaller and significantly, so that was great. This kind of shows us that the way the cortex is responding to an input is reduced when people say that they're thinking about something other than the environment. And then with Daniel and Chris Gorgolowski, we did a study using a sort of a publicly available data set where we managed to get one of a questionnaire that I invented in my office, which is, I don't know, it's a rubbish questionnaire, but it worked at least in this much. We could show that these two areas of cortex, which are basically part of the visual system, were responding at rest less. They weren't doing anything as much for the people who said that their thought, well, this red blob here was more active for people whose thoughts were not specific, and this green thing was more active for people who weren't thinking about the future very much. And this is what they look like as networks. And so the paper is a bit vague because we had about 15 of these blobs, all kinds of different areas with all kinds of different thoughts. But the ones there were only 3 actually that made sense to me, and these are 2 of them. So, but the point is that these are suggesting that some competition takes place between the way that the visual system is acting at rest with nothing to do, and the kind of experiences that people reported at the end of a resting state scan. Okay? So this is kind of loose evidence, I guess, for this idea that there must be sort of a way that people can have a cognitive state that's independent of the way the input is being presented. And we can see that with ERPs and fMRI. So that's some vague evidence for independence. I didn't really want to talk too much about this because it's not really part of the component process idea I'm trying to convince you of today, except for the fact that it does allow there to be 2 modes. So the most interesting interpretation of this, I think, is that this is how we detach our attention from the outside world. So that basically is like the prerequisite of the mind-wandering state, if you like. But it's not really answering the problem that I'm interested in at the moment, which is how on earth do we explain the variety of it? And what on earth is the default mode doing? So just to go back, that since I kind of went to York and started hanging out with Beth and also somebody called Tom Hartley who knows a lot about hippocampus, it became obvious to me that I could go beyond this kind of, like before I went to York, I would say things like long-term memory, and that was it. I would just say that's how the thoughts work. It's all to do with long-term memory. And then you start hanging out with Beth, and there's obviously this model which I explained probably not very well, and then this is the hippocampus and all its kind of intricacies. And both of these are to do with knowledge, right? Because the hippocampus encodes and explains, encodes our information about what has happened to us. And it's also probably involved in things about thinking about the future, but basically it's to do with episodic knowledge. And then the ATL is to do with this more conceptual knowledge. So, and there's an interesting sort of difference between these 2 systems because this guy is all about specific things that definitely happen. So when it works properly, you can say things like, I definitely saw that shape in that experiment. Whereas the ATL is doing something almost the opposite. Because it's saying, dogs, I've seen hundreds of dogs, and it's not very good for remembering one dog, it's very good for remembering the whole class of dogs. And so there's an interesting fact that you have this kind of 2 sort of contrasting ways that you understand knowledge, and that both of these are part of the default mode network, right? So this kind of suggests that one of the roles that this network plays is somehow integrating these 2 pieces of information together in order to kind of allow people to express, I believe, in their imagination, thoughts of this information. Thoughts based on knowledge about what's either happened to them, what might happen, or how the world works. And so one of the things that I just did for a paper I'm writing with Daniel was we just did a meta-analysis using Neurosynth. And I just wanted to illustrate that there's quite a lot of evidence, really, that these two systems are like the default mode network. So this is the picture of PCC's connectivity that I showed you earlier, which we made with Bayesian York. But this is if you just go into Neurosynth and find, I mean, admittedly there's quite a lot of topics, and I find the two that look the best, but they are semantic and episodic, and that's what PALs call them. And you can see that, for example, you know, they all have these medial prefrontal cortex PCC things. They differ to the extent on the role of the hippocampus, which is more for episodic than the semantic one, and they both have like some stuff going on in the ATL. And so basically, they're very quite similar to the default mode network pattern. But of course, the point is that this is a meta-analysis from tasks. So at the introduction, I wanted to really make it clear to everybody, this is why it's not a task-negative network. I mean, these are tasks. This is where this comes from, right? And this isn't a task, and they resemble each other. So really easy reverse inference you can draw from this, which I don't think can possibly be wrong, is that when whatever the default mode is allowing people to do, it's got to have something to do with our knowledge that we've gained through experience. And that can either be general knowledge, like the semantic system, or episodic knowledge, maybe because of the hippocampus. But in either case, it's probably where we're getting our thoughts from. Okay? I'm just going to put that as a bold claim. Thoughts come from experience. But we can also take this and ask experiments. So this is Irena, who I met because she came to visit Daniel, and she did an internship, and then she came to York to do a PhD with me, and so Bethany was supervising her. And one of the things we worked out you could do was take this idea about there being two systems and test it via resting state. Okay? So there's a paradigm which I think you guys know about because I think you've used it in the past, which is called this. Has various different names. I encountered it as a self-reference effect, but it simply works like this: people make semantic judgments. Are you happy? Is your best friend confident? And is David Cameron, who was is he proud? Now, these are semantic judgments in the sense that we're not asking people to say, what did David Cameron do, or what did you do? We're just saying, do these words apply to these? So it's basically a semantic judgment, okay? But then what's funny is, this one in particular leads to a really, really strong memory. Okay, so that's basically an episodic fact. So what happens is if you say to people, did you see these words? You'll have something called the self-reference advantage, and it's basically somehow to do with semantic and episodic memory playing out together. Okay? And so one of the things we can do with this is you can see how does that relate to the default mode network. Okay, because one of the things I've already shown you is that these two systems basically have a very similar spatial distribution. So what Irena did was we have this data in, say, 40 people, we know how well they remembered the words, and we can take seed points in the default mode network and see how does that play out with respect to their memory. Okay? And what we found was really interesting, because if we took some seeds all the way up to medial prefrontal cortex. So there's a paper, I'm only showing you, we had two more seeds in addition to this. We had one here, ventromedial, the temporal pole, and then one which is dorsal medial prefrontal cortex. Of the seeds, I think there was one other pattern I'm not showing you just now, but two patterns were really, really interesting, and you can see them here. So first of all, you can see that we get this self-reference effect. So all of these bars are different from each other. So they have more memory for the self than best friend than David Cameron. And that's basically what should happen. So that was great. This is a very strong effect, actually, so it's very easy to replicate. But the things that were cool was, first of all, if we took the hippocampus seed, okay, which is an episodic memory system if you wanted to do a reverse inference, but also about a small localized process. Like, I don't think the inference that the hippocampus is involved in episodic memory is one that we should not be able to draw. It connected more to this area of the anterior temporal lobe if I remembered the self lobe. And that's really fascinating because it's like saying that the semantic and episodic memory system join together, and the people who they do that the most for, I forgot to say that we did the resting states first. So the resting states already recorded in these people. It predicts their memory. So it's like if you join these two systems together at rest, and then the next day we ask you to do this little task, you'll be the sort of person who has a very strong memory, okay? And that's nice because it's joining these two systems together, okay? And that's fascinating, I thought. But also, this other seed, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, had possibly even a more interesting pattern. And you can see that here. So it actually separates best friend memory from self-memory. It does it in a totally awesome way because self-memory gives you much more of basically the parietal and temporal lobe parts of the default mode network. So if I'm really good at remembering myself, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex will be able to do that better if I have this pattern of connectivity with this other part of cortex. But best friend memory basically couples to this thing, which is a totally different network, and it actually resembles something that John Duncan has called the multi-demand network, which is a system that's supposed to be involved in kind of like difficult commanding tasks, and it's supposed to be sort of a domain general system. And the point here is that if I'm going to remember my best friend, it's not as automatic as my memory for myself is. So this pattern here could simply mean the fact that in order to perform this type of sort of incidental encoding, we need to have a different organisation for the brain. So that was very nice. Okay, so that basically just shows somehow that one of the things a default mode network is helping people do is this kind of joining together of these different types of information, somehow linking semantic and episodic memory together, I think it is. Okay, so then there's a more troublesome one, which is this guy. So these two are fascinating for the reason I explained earlier, which is that they basically behave totally like a team, and they're really far apart. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. Like, I remember when I was young, and you learned about the two hemispheres. And the idea was, well, you could lose a hemisphere if you're young enough, and it would be fine, and that's why you have two of them, right? Well, it wouldn't make any sense if we cut the brain off here, it'll be fine, because you've still got a PCC. So everything the median prefrontal cortex can do doesn't matter. You've lost the front, the back will do the job. So that can't possibly be the inference we would draw about the fact that these two spatially distinct places are always on together. So they must be doing something else. And this has puzzled me for absolutely ages. And so what happened one day, is this the next one? No, okay, so I've got to get here first, right? So this is a cool study that was kind of an accident. Well, no, this one wasn't an accident, actually. The one that preceded this was an accident. So I did this experiment just as I left California, and its results are kind of consistent with this, but I didn't expect it. But then Mahiko, who's one of my other PhD students, he came to work, and we did this task, which is an improvement on the one that I had already published in Neuroimage. All that happens is you see shapes, okay? But there are two blocked conditions. So the first condition is what we call zero back. Because all that happens is you see these shapes, and then every so often there's like a square in the middle of the screen with a square on it in this case. And that just says which side is this square on. So it could be a circle or a triangle. And your job in this case is to say here, it's right, so you push the right button. Just totally boring, very easy task. It's a variant on the number task that I mentioned earlier on. And it's a proven for reasons we don't need to go into. But the totally awesome thing is that we have this other condition where at this point you're seeing essentially, you have counterbalance and so on and so forth, the same stimulus. But here you get this screen, which has got a square on it again, and it's got two question marks. And all you have to do now is say, where was the square? So you look back in your mind and you say the square was on the right hand side, so the button push is the same. So at this point in time, the only difference is that you're seeing question marks. The response is the same, but the cognitive difference is that back here is where your memory, that's what informs your behaviour, and you can't see that. It's like 2.5 seconds in the past, right? So what happens is if you compare this moment in time across these two conditions, is you recover the default mode network, right? And this is totally amazing because, you know, like, if you were to go to like some theories of the default mode, they would say things like, it is the self, right? Well, I'm not really sure that that is the inference I would draw based on this result. So it doesn't seem necessary to assume that this is the self. It's more like, this is a form of behaviour, okay? Because that's the cool thing. It's behaviour that just is to do with something that I can't see at that moment in time. And the other thing to note is that it's coming on in the difficult condition, right? So this is also awesome because normally the default mode network goes down as tasks get difficult, okay? So this is, I think, really quite an important result because all it says is this default mode network can do difficult tasks, and it can also care about where squares and triangles are, which is not a personally autobiographically relevant piece of information. So what this does is it says you can actually, if you want to care about the medial part of the default mode network, you can kind of give up things like emotion and self and autobiography and probably replace it with, I need it in order to make behaviour happen where I can't be constrained by the input. Okay? Which would, if you think, be necessary for future thinking, remembering the past. One's sense of self has this by definition, because I'm the same person as I was yesterday, and I can't see that information when I do that. So this system is doing something much, much simpler than many of the hypotheses that people have. But this still doesn't tell us what the two different things are doing, right? So that's the stuff I want to talk about next. So having thought about all of this for a while, this is a bit of a backwards story because at least some of this data was collected. Well, actually, I don't know. Well, let me just pretend I thought of it this way. So let's imagine we had a hypothesis about what these two systems did. Okay. Well, somebody called Stephen Fleming, he had done this science paper where he'd shown that the medial prefrontal cortex was, or parts of it at least, maybe this is a bit rostral, but it was important for metacognition. Okay. And I kind of knew about that because I think at one point I was like the frontal pole and metacognition. People thought they go together for a while. The posterior cingulate, when I was working with Daniel, and actually when Arena visited at the beginning, I was really obsessing about it because I could even at that point tell that it's where things meet, right? I mean, there's basically, look, there's one lobe here, it joins onto the, it's kind of like, you can imagine the temporal lobe goes there, forwards you've got the medial prefrontal cortex, so it seemed to be a place where things might meet. And then I started reading this work by people at in London, I can't remember which university, and this paper is awesome because what they do is they just basically do this ICA thing which we've already talked about, and then what they do is they just say, I've got, say, 20 networks, it doesn't really matter, the point is that there are many networks, and this picture here just shows you parts of the brain where more than one network are being copied by that voxel's behaviour. And the warmer the colours, the more the things are being mirrored. And you can see that there's like a bit in the angular gyrus, and a bit in the PCC, and so on and so forth. So anyway, that kind of talks about things that are, it's a bit like, what's interesting about it to me is that they're both kind of integrative processes. So metacognition is supposed to be something where I like reflect upon my experiences. That's how Fleming would operationalise it. But this is also like integration because if I mirror many, many things, I'm also integrating. But they aren't quite the same. So it's kind of, I think this is quite possibly somehow close to the reason why they operate together. If that makes sense. Anyway, so these are two types of representation that you can have. And then they might differentiate the two things. And what I'm going to try to do is convince you in some way that this might be what they do. So somebody called Ben Baird came to visit me and at the MPI. So he was a PhD student in California when I was there, and then he came to do brain imaging, so me and Daniel and him, various other people did some experiments, and this is one of them. The experiment really was just this kind of vague idea I had because I wanted to know about the medial prefrontal cortex, but Ben was one of these people who's quite interested in like consciousness and all that kind of stuff, which I think is interesting, but I don't really know what to do, so I wanted to know about the medial prefrontal cortex. So I thought, well, maybe we could get Ben to do something to do with like meta stuff. That's a bit like conscious. He would kind of quite like that. And he's like a machine. He produced like, I don't know, 7 or 8 papers in his thesis. He was a great student. Anyway, so then I thought metacognition, that'd be great. That would match Ben's interest. And if something to do with the medial frontal cortex, I'll be fine. And so what we did is we just thought, well, I wonder if there were more than one type of metacognition. Well, actually, at this point we thought there would only be one, but that wasn't the case. But anyway, to do that, we just got people to do, this is basically Stephen Fleming's task. You see gather patches, and then you decide which one had a difference, which is this point here, is different from the two things. And then you say, how confident are you? And I thought, well, that's fine. But I had a kind of sneaking plan that I also wanted to know about memory. Because I was, at this point, beginning to home in the idea that memory in the default mode wouldn't be enemies, at least. So we then did this other thing, which was learn some words, then afterwards, did you see the word, and then are you confident? And so using this information, you can calculate something called meta D prime, which is very complicated, but essentially it just means, does your accuracy match your thinking about how accurate you are? And that's how people define metacognition. It's like, if I am wrong, and I'm not confident, or right and confident, I have great metacognition, but if they flip around, I don't. So if I'm right, and I think I'm wrong, or wrong, I think I'm right, my metacognition is shit. And so the thing is, you can do that for both of these two tasks. And then the really weird thing is, they totally don't correlate. So what that means is if I'm good at doing it with perception, that doesn't mean I'm good at doing it from memory. And this is two different data sets, and actually somebody else has shown something similar, so it's probably even true. And so that was weird, because we were like, well, that's kind of strange. I thought if there was going to be like a homunculus anywhere, it would be like metacognition. I'll go to one place, be like, da-na-na. But the point is, it didn't, and behaviourally, that's obvious. Well, of course, the problem is that this is a null result, right? So basically, if we ran 1.5 million people, it would correlate significantly. This would be a very important correlation. But because we were working at the MPI and because we were working with Daniel, we did a resting state analysis of some of those people. And what we found was there were two parts of the frontal pole. This is where Stephen Fleming did his experiment. And this basically is like the core of the default mode on the medial surface. And what was really amazing was that these two parts of the brain separate their connectivity patterns based on the two tasks. So if I was good at the memory task, I'd have a certain pattern of correlation which you can see here from this seed region, from the default mode one. And if I was good at the perception task, I would have this one. So what this means is that my metacognition is separable into two components. They both have something to do with the medial prefrontal cortex, but they have different networks of support. Okay? So that's kind of interesting because if we were trying to understand what this integration process could be like you couldn't do this unless you were integrating. Metacognition must be the consequence of an integration process. It can't be any other way around. Something must be integrated, and then I must do stuff. That's what the metacognition data is telling us, and it seems to be that the medial prefrontal cortex is good at this, because it's got at least two places that do two different types of it. So it's almost like a place where representations kind of are supervised, maybe, or something like that. So that's that guy. But then the other thing happened where, because of the work I'd been doing with Keith theory, and also because of a paper by one other person I've collaborated with who did work with Buckner, and they did a fractionation of the default mode network called Jessica Andrew Hanna, and she kind of worked out that there might be subsystems within the default mode network. And so what we wanted to do was take these guys, which are not in the core, so we've got something at approximately the hippocampus, and then these two seeds that are in the temporal lobe. And we just picked them out for our paper simply because it seemed like a good place to have all your seeds coming from one place. But the important point is that if we thought that this was an integrator, okay, then it could be integrating from these guys. In fact, that's kind of the point of some of the studies I've been trying to convince you of. That if this is where we're representing knowledge of some type, and I'm going to use that to think, it would have to be integrated. Because when I think, I don't just think in episodic information, I might think about that in collaboration with conceptual pieces of information too. So what we did was the biggest experiment I ever did until I got a very big grant. I'm about to do an even bigger one now. But this was 90 people come into the lab and they do this totally dumb task with numbers. And we do the thing to their thoughts to get the people moves. And so I was trying to do this big science thing. So I thought, well, also I'll get a replication sample. But I couldn't afford to have two sets of resting state data. So these guys have resting state data, these people don't. But the point is that they all did this. And if I do this decomposition, you can see we get really similar patterns. It's quite striking. I'm really happy about this particular slide. It looks good. Get the same PCA structure. It's beautiful, I think. But anyway, so these dudes here, they've got resting state. So all we really needed to do then was take those seed points. Because if it was the case that the default mode is somehow summarizing my knowledge, and it is reflected in these types of thoughts, we would get traction's problem by testing it with a resting state sample. So these people had already had the resting state experiment, and then we do the mind wandering. So this is just the seed map, so I'll skip over that because it's really relevant. So we basically had loads of seeds, 5 in fact, all these types of thoughts. We had to do some kind of quite heavy corrections. In fact, we had 5 different seeds and all these kind of things. So what you can see here are just blobs which reflect connectivity between each of these different things. This is the medial prefrontal cortex seed, okay, which I just talked about with the metacognition thing. This is the temporal pole, so this is part of the anterior temporal, this is the hippocampus, and this is a lateral temporal cortex seed. Okay? So these are regions whose connectivity patterns were associated with the types of thoughts. Now actually, in this case, it doesn't really actually matter what the types of thoughts are. They're just related to what people said they thought about, or in fact the decomposition of these thoughts. But what's really amazing is look here, here, and here, right? They all focus on the PCC, right? It's totally awesome. Look what happens when you do conjunction. This little white thing, right? That's where they overlap. That's that there. That's the seed region that Jessica Andrews Hanna gave us, right? It's just amazing. I couldn't believe it. It was like it's all going to this little part here. And then what we can do is we can take more data and we can seed from this little thing, and you get exactly the same map, right? So what this must mean, I think, is that spontaneous thought requires systems that are more likely to be representing knowledge to be integrated. And that's what the PCC does, right? And that's really interesting because if you think about, well, this is, yeah, so, okay, so basically after we did this, actually Beth said, let's see if we can get double dissociation. So we can. Ruden's wise, we can't get double dissociation, but we can get evidence the medial prefrontal cortex is not doing this sort of thing to the same extent. Because basically, none of the whole brain regressions focus on the medial prefrontal cortex at all. So then what we thought was, okay, so let's really try to prove that that is not happening. So we can't quite do that. But what we can do is we can take the mask of the PCC's connectivity. Okay, it just seemed like a good place to start. So we throw out all of the brain, apart from the bit in this pink thing. And then we say, okay, having done that, do we now see any evidence that the medial prefrontal cortex collects stuff? And it does. This tiny little thing here is a collection point, in the same way the PCC was. But it's much, much weaker, okay? Much less strong than the PCC is, because none of it is passing whole brain correction. We have to really mask stuff down to show that. So it seems like what the PCC is doing is much more likely to be taking information and pulling it together than the medial prefrontal cortex is. And that's interesting because the medial prefrontal cortex is doing something different but with metacognition. So it seems like my idea at the moment is that this system has got to have something to do with massive amounts of integration. But it's doing it quite differently because the medial prefrontal cortex is allowing us to kind of like use integrated information to make adjustments perhaps, where the posterior cingulate is allowing it to be accumulated. So I was in the pub drunk with Beth one night, and we just thought, maybe this guy, okay, it's like the moment, right? It's like the moment you're in. Because that would be perfectly reasonable to assume that's where it's collecting from sensory, auditory, knowledge, and it represents sort of like where you are, okay? Whereas this guy here, he's not doing that. He's more like, what's my point? Adjusting things and keeping you on track. So that's a kind of idea about what we think the core might be doing. That's very much a speculation. We gave this talk to the lab to try to explain some of these ideas because they're quite abstract really. We started off with a slide that Beth got up where it just said, this is all rampant speculation, and then a quote from me saying the only thing we're totally sure about is this is all wrong. So that's a caveat you should know about this. But the point is, at the least now, I think there's a hypothesis about what these two things do that are different. Because you notice that you couldn't really do metacognition unless integration had happened. So it might be that these two guys have to talk to each other simply because it's necessary for this kind of more useful adjustment to happen for there to be some integration happening earlier. And so they might talk to each other for this very reason. Okay, so the final thing I just want to do is talk about an experiment we're also writing up at the moment, where we were interested here in what's the whole point of all of this, right? Why on earth would you have this default mode network? And so what I'm trying to clarify with these slides is just, we can think about goals in all kinds of different ways, right? One goal is not to do something. So basically, at the beginning of mind wandering experiments, it was all like, stop your mind wandering, stay on task, pay attention to the numbers in the task which you don't care about, which is a bit of a silly way to think about an important goal. And this is obviously when we found train spotting, which is about the kind of things that people make decisions about in life, right? And actually, why on earth would we want to focus on the Stroop task, for example? Whereas deciding what to do in our life is a very important goal, okay? And the funny thing about it is that psychology is totally set up to study these kind of goals over here, and ill-equipped to study these goals, I think. And that's daft, because this is like a much more important set of goals. What are you going to do with your life? So to do this, again, it's the same idea. We already had resting state data, because it's cheap to do this, because we can use it for all kinds of different things. This time what happens is, 50 people come into the, well, actually there was 100. Half of them have resting state, half of them are like a control sample. They come in, we measure what they think about, and then we just ask them to spend 15 minutes in one of two conditions, describing their goals or describing television programs that they like. So they pick 3 goals or 3 television programs, they write about each for 5 minutes. Then we make them do the stupid task again, and then the last part is surprising them and saying, please write down the goals again of the television programs. Now the reason we wanted to do this is because you can think about this as an incubation period, right? Now, one of the things that you could do if the default mode network was functioning properly, at least in some senses, is you could imagine it's a system that allows people to move through goals without acting. Right? That would be a really useful thing. It's kind of like implicit in why people care about future thinking as a concept, right? Because if I can prepare for something before it happens, I'd be better. Right? So what we could do was we could like say, what was different about the writing people did here and here, and can I explain any of that variance by the thoughts they did here? Because this would be like an incubation period, right? And because some of them are resting state, is there a resting state corner? And here we wanted to specifically test one of Randy Buckner and probably other people's ideas that the hippocampus is important for this. So for example, in rats, if you put electrodes into the place fields, I think they're called, what the place fields do is they encode how rats move through a maze. That's them learning the steps. Once they've learned the steps, they fire forwards before they go through the maze. That's basically supposed to be indicative of the fact that the rats know where to go. And so that's it's called the prospective consolidation hypothesis. So we had, in this case, a very strong reason to look only at the hippocampus, and that's the only place we actually seeded in this experiment. But anyway, so we just did a sort of decomposition thing. These are just heat maps. This is basically we rated the goals that people said, calculated the difference between the pre and post scores, and decomposed them with PCA, and you get this map, which is like one component was abstract or concrete, so on and so forth. We also do this decomposition in the thoughts. Again, we're finding some similar pattern, which is quite nice. And then what you can do is you can ask the question, of the thoughts that were occurring in this incubation period, were any of them predicting the change in the goals? And if you put all of these in as predictors of all of these, you just get one effect, and it's a task, it's a condition by type of thought interaction. And it is that if the goals became more concrete, they did more future thinking in the goal condition, and that was a stronger regression slope than any of the other ones. Okay? So for example, what this means is that future thinking doesn't make you describe things more concretely unless the thing you're describing is goal related. And then what we could do is we can first of all do sort of a sanity check, because these maps are the whole brain connectivity of our hippocampus mass, and they are not different before the conditions. And because we recorded the resting state first, this is like, you know, when you do a manipulation check to find out that your two groups didn't differ in neuroticism. So what this means is the hippocampal connectivity maps of the two groups were identical before we did anything. But then what's totally awesome is that the hippocampus, coupled with this region of the, well, basically we think it's the PSMA, and it did so in a totally awesome way because look, it was more connected if you would describe your goals in a more concrete way after this period, and less connected if you did that with a television program. So what that means is that the connection between this part of the brain and this part of the brain, before you even went into my experiment, would have told me whether you were going to make your goals more concrete. It's like a personality trait of some type that drives people to write down more concrete goals after an incubation period. So it's quite a strange effect, but it's highly specific. Because you can see that, look, the average connectivity between these two groups is not different. Okay? So it's got to have something to do with being able to describe personally relevant information in a more concrete way. And we think that that's because this is actually for planning. So when people make decisions about how to plan actions properly, they use this part of the brain. So we think that this is going to be reverse inference, but that what this connectivity pattern is telling us is that people are kind of going through some type of future-related action planning thing that allows them consequently to describe their goals in a more concrete way. Now that's obviously a reverse inference, but it's really interesting that we see just this specific pattern for this condition. So that's kind of all I'm going to say. I think I really tried to focus on these three different processes. I didn't really deal with the independence one as much as the other two, but basically that's the kind of way we're thinking about stuff at the moment. And yeah, not as much else to say. A couple of closing points are, why might this matter? Well, one of the things I'm quite obsessed with and have been for several years is this idea that the whole way that cognitive psychology set itself out has been very narrow. Because one of the things it really loves to do is to have these totally constrained paradigms where behaviour and stimulus and responses are closely linked. It's obviously been think about this as Pavlovian and Skinnerian learning, where what happens is people learn contingencies and understand behaviour in the short-term relationship. Whereas the default mode seems to be interesting in this context because it certainly doesn't help you do these sorts of things, at least not directly. But all the work I've been showing you suggests that it's probably doing something almost as important but at a much longer time scale. But one of the things that's good about that is it seems to be able to do this in a way where it's not caring about the input you're in at the moment. And so there's a concept called freedom from immediacy that people have talked about, something called Mike Shadlin and Patrick Haggard have, and it's all about this idea that this gives you this degree of freedom that allows you to behave in a different way to the way the stimulus demands, the environment demands that you do. And that's obviously a very helpful thing. So it could be that the default mode network is important in that sense. And so what we're trying to do now in my group, in conjunction with Beth, who's obviously the other manager, is we're trying to formalise this so there's like proper this is our triangle. Beth calls it, when we think about triangulating, which is pretty cool really. But the point is that we're trying to kind of come up with a testable taxonomy of different types of states that default mode could be important in. So for example, one of the big puzzles of the default mode is, look, half of the world think it's like an intrusive thought system, the rest of them think it's creative, and some people like me think it's involved in goals, right? And so somehow there has to be an explanation for why. I mean, there's evidence for all of this, right? So they can't all be wrong. And so somehow we have to have a much more sophisticated way to think about all of this. So we call this the triangle model. And what we're really trying to get at is, you know, because Beth has expertise in specific processes, it might be possible to sort of capitalise upon essentially the bigger issue about the problem, which is that you can imagine that there are like little constrained components that we can identify by normal experiments where you have conditions, and I've never really done very many of them, but I'm quite excited by the prospect. You can control for things and contrast things against each other and localise small subcomponents. And then take a broader view and say, well, how do they all interact together? How do they build up to do the things that I'm more naturally interested in, like, you know, thinking about the future or trying to solve a problem in a novel way? And so, for example, one of the things we're quite obsessed with at the moment, I only put this in just because of some of Daniel's work, which is we really are fascinated by this part of the cortex. I mean, it's all very interesting, but this part here seems really interesting. This is just a slide that I'm trying to summarise for a paper I'm writing with Daniel and Beth, which is just trying to get at what on earth could it be that it's doing. And it has to have, we think it might have something to do with specificness, because this is a paper we just published in the Journal of Neuroscience, where we just did TMS to various different parts of the temporal lobe. But if we TMS here, people become suddenly not very good at making judgments about whether specific items relate to each other in a semantic sense. But admittedly, this is the other side, but this is the only other thing that made sense in the resting state paper I talked about earlier, that Chris Gorgolewski was the first author on, which was this part of the brain was more active for people whose thoughts were specific. Okay? It's also not too far away from one of the places where the metacognition experiment localized a connectivity for the medial prefrontal cortex to if people were really good at metacognition for memory, which has to have something to do with specificity, because you can't possibly be good at metacognition and not probably be sure that you specifically saw that item. And this is just weird because in one of Mihiko's papers, we found this region is also more activated in the easy rather than the hard tasks. So it seems like we don't have the faintest idea, but we would really like to know what the significance of this is, and I think it's got something to do with specificity. And so I just want to close by saying, basically, most of this work, I'm so lucky at the moment because I basically get to stand up here and not really have done any of the detailed work with it. It's really awesome. Most of the time I just like get sent images of the brain, and I do things like make slides up like this. It's really peculiar, right? It's really good fun. So I notice things like this, but it's very large scale. I'm not really doing the work so much anymore. So these people do it. Like Beth and my group, we've got 20 people now. It's awesome. They're all really brilliant. Gary Green runs the imaging centre, and he's got some really interesting techniques for using this. Boris, who works at the MNI, and there's that. And so basically, these are all the people who do all the real work. And I just wanted to say that I was really lucky to get this grant from ERC. But the thing is, we've got so many imaging hours. We've got 1,000 imaging hours to spend in the next 5 years. If people think any of this is interesting, they would like to help, and they could come and visit to help us collect the data. That would be really, really good. So basically, that's all I really have to say. So, thank you for listening. That was probably far too long.
Well, that's good.
It was impossible to stop you.
Well, Mika's got.
I have one question. It's a long way away from your last point. It was related to the working memory task, and so I'm really puzzled and interested in why you seem to get the default network for the more difficult task, given that for the last 15 years,
Yes.
people that have been doing these very similar tasks have found the opposite pattern.
Okay, so basically there's two parts of the story that's interesting. Okay, first one is it's a peculiar variety of a working memory task that I invented by accident. Okay, I invented it by accident because all I really wanted this task to do, and I invented something like this in like 6 years ago. One of my friends had a science paper on mind wandering, right? And what they did was they manipulated how often it happened by making people practice a task. And at that point I worked out this was a really helpful thing to be able to, because it gave you a boundary condition. You could switch it on and off to a certain extent. And at that point we'd been doing things like looking at reading tasks and letting people mind wander, but you only had one condition, so you couldn't really understand it so well, I worked out. So all I wanted was a task that was easy and hard, and I wanted it to be matched as far as possible. Now the thing is, that if I did it this way, right, what I wanted was, I didn't want people to be getting confused at this point in the task about which condition they were in, right? So instead of doing the normal thing, right, which would be to repeat, because that's how normally working memory tasks work, I thought, well, that might be a bit confusing for people, because you don't normally have this other thing in those tasks. So I thought, let's keep it simple in the participants. So I didn't really care about this task. It was totally not why I did it. It was like to suppress mind wandering so you could look at it here. And if you do this contrast, you get more default mode activity here, actually. So that's the first reason for doing it. But then one of the postdocs I've just employed for my grant, he's just completing his PhD at Cambridge. And it was really peculiar because he started doing this graph theory thing, where you now take graphs of the brain and you look at how it changes across conditions of a task. And he basically found that the default mode under a zero back condition does not talk to the working memory system. And as you increase the demands of the task, it starts integrating all the information from the working memory task to allow you to do the thing. And they've just had that accepted in Journal of Neuroscience, and I know that because I was a reviewer. And then immediately after that, he applied for my job, which was totally awesome. I was like, that's one good reason for signing your reviews, I must say. Sometimes people don't like you, but people apply for your jobs if you support their argument, which is nice. Anyway, so I think it's actually because of the nature of the task, because the difference, of course, is that here, if I did a repeat, like the normal working memory task, right, you still have some perceptual information to guide your behaviour. But this is maxing out the absence of perceptual information to guide your behaviour, because here, you have to, you're not told what, you have to decide which side it's on, not is it the same. So if I make a saying judgment, like it's like a similarity, a familiarity effect. This is a little bit more like a recollection judgment. And actually the thing that I'm not showing you here is that there's also activity in the working memory system that's stronger here. So what's cool about this condition is, sorry here, right? So what's cool about this task is that you're actually getting the two systems together. So it's not the case that you don't get more working memory here. It's just you get more working memory plus more default. Does that make sense? Like the
I'm not sure I understood. I suppose my answer is no then.
Okay, so the normal working memory task is it's a repeat.
Yeah.
What happens is when you see two things in a row, you push a button. Now, under those circumstances, the second stimulus is something that you can see. Here, it's a question mark, right? So question mark does not tell you which side the thing's on. It's not saying, did you see something similar? It's saying, you definitely saw something, what was it? So I think that's the difference between recollection and familiarity, right? If I just do the repeating thing, all I have to do is, oh, that seems familiar to me. I don't even have to remember for sure what I saw. It could be done in a kind of pattern completion system. Whereas here, there has to be more of the system generating the response. So what I think this means is that the primary function that this system has, and this goes actually back to why you would have it in rats, right? So say you were a rat and you wanted to be able to find something that at that moment you can't see. That's a problem the rat would be able to solve, right? Nobody in the room would be like, well, as soon as the rat cannot see something, like it's behind him, or he saw it 3 seconds ago, that's it, over, and it just goes off. They might not be super good at using that information, but they can certainly do something with it. That's all these people are doing. They're saying, yeah, there was a tribe that was on the right-hand side. They're not doing anything complicated with autobiography or planning, or they're just saying, yeah, like some information is available in my system and I'm using it to guide behaviour, even though I can't see what it is at this moment in time. So this is like a really simple thing, but you would need it to think about the future, because I can't see that. I need to remember the past, because I can't see that either. a sense of self is defined by me being consistent over time. So when I think about me, I would also have to use this process. So it's a really simple process, but it's one that you could build complicated cognitive states out of. Well, that's what I think. And actually, we found this before. This is like the second time I've seen it. We had there was a kind of flaw. I have a paper in your image, right, that shows this pattern, but there's a flaw in the paradigm that we fixed here. So the fact that it's in this experiment too, it gave me a lot of confidence that it's not totally nonsense, if that makes sense.
I don't get, how do you respond in the one, what you call the one back?
You just push a button. So in this case, you would push the right mouse button, or the right, because the square is there.
Square is.
Square?
Where was the square?
Yeah, this guy in the middle is just saying this is your target. And the difference really is here, you can do all of that just with your eyes, really. You could have like a loop from eye to hand that would solve this part. Here, the loop has to involve something else, because I can't see. And to be honest, the flaw in the old paradigm was, it was just numbers. So it would just be numbers being on the screen. And actually what happened was this journalist from the New York Times came to visit, okay? And we made him do this task because he wanted some measure of like what mind wandering would be like. And he came out and he said, see that other task, that harder one, was I supposed to just put my finger on the button? Because if you imagine these were like, this would be a number 5, and at this point he'd be asked, was it odd or even? And he said, so the point surely was I put my finger at this point on the odd button, and then if it came up, I pushed it. I was like, fuck. Damn it. I've just ran that experiment an awful lot and it's got a huge flaw. So we came up with this one because you can't do this now. Because here, you don't know that it's going to be the squares, it could be the triangle. So you don't have, you can't put 2 fingers down and then solve the problem with that. You have to have something in your head that solves the problem. And it's quite funny because when we did this, right, the reviewer said, like I could show you, but we have DLPFC and stuff like that going on too. The reviewer said, and the saliency network comes onto it, all the rest of it is perfectly standard. The reviewer said, you don't have any working memory activation in this thing. Well, I don't know how we could possibly conclude that, because the first figure, which I'm not showing you now, has most of the prefrontal cortex on, including this bit, and then we masked that out because the point was just to look at the problem.
So, what we go back to those slides about the traits, adjectives, self-descriptions are, right?
Yes.
Because it, as you know, it has a really interesting story that it started out as a memory experiment, and then people found out that actually you remember much better when it relates to yourself.
Yes.
And then it became kind of the standard way to measure or find yourself in the brain.
Yes.
Which is kind of dubious, and yet maybe not quite dubious. So,
Yes.
What would be your take on this? Is this showing us ourselves, or what is it showing us? What's this contrast really about?
Well, that's the thing. Rena gets, I think this is the bit she hates the most. I think she's quite enjoying her PhD, but she hates this part because whenever I talked about it, I simply just wanted to know. Like, so we're about to scan it, right? And one of the reasons I want to scan it is because there's a theory about the default mode that's called the encoding flip hypothesis, right? Which is basically just that. If the default mode's on, I can't encode. So this paradigm shows that's nonsense, because as you know, if you scan people, basically they switch it on, and when they switch it on, the more they switch it on, the better they remember. So we wanted to do that, and do connectivity analysis, and look at resting periods and stuff like that. So I think it's just a system. What she would prefer it if we could make definitive statements about the self, because that's kind of what drives her interest. But the problem is that I don't know actually whether you could use this to drive an understanding about the self, because it seems to me that there's 2 possible ways this could work. I mean, I guess my personal opinion, if I had to guess, would be the self is the product of a system that's very good at remembering. Like, it seems like if you couldn't do that, it would be hard to have a sense of self. So in that case, you see, what people, I suppose you're saying is like, is this effect because the memory is good, or is it because it's the self? And I don't actually think you can separate those 2 in some senses, because it's just as important to have a good memory, to have some aspect that you can remember about yourself.
Which in a way was the part in the early papers as well, and then
Yes.
it all became moved into saying here is the neural correlator of the self.
Yes.
Completely different.
I mean, the thing is, so in the triangle model I showed you at the end, right? So Beth would call this automatic semantic retrieval. So like you get this on if the task is like you're being shown words, one of them will go really strong with the other word, like if it would be dog and bone versus dog and beach, for example. Because obviously one could say, yeah, well, beach goes with dog because you go for a walk, but dog goes with the bone directly. It's probably the first thing you would generate if you had to generate. And so you get this on under those circumstances. So I think that we would probably say, well, you know, it seems like a better inference might be automatically strong retrieval is how you do the self-reference task. That's probably the best way to think about it. And of course, one can imagine that you build a self in that way.
But now you actually said the self is depending on the good memory, which would be the right memory, I guess. Did you distinguish between people being good and bad at that task? Because I don't think that you need that.
With this so how we do this is good and bad. It's a surprise task. We don't really know. They didn't know they were going to do it.
Yeah.
We just ask, we correct for the false alarms. So these regressions are like, this is a pattern that the people who do the most self-retrieving show. Okay. What we're about to do in her experiment is it's going to be, I don't know how it's going to work, we're scanning them whilst they do this, and then basically at the end, we take them out of the scanner and we say, did you see this word? If they say yes, we say, which referent was it? Then they would have to pick one of these guys, and then they have to say, how confident are you? So that would allow us to be a bit closer, because one of the things we would really like to know, for example, we have a theory about the people with semantic aphasia, because these regions are preserved for people who have aphasia, because what they have lost is a region here, they have a region there, right? And so the theory is that those people can't control retrieval, so they make mistakes. So if I have semantic aphasia, what will happen is I start generating words of a particular, like words beginning with the letter L, and then I switch to words in a category related to one of the words I generate. And we think that's because they can't help but retrieve strong associates. So we want to know whether this effect is like unrelated to metacognition, because you can imagine that people might not really understand that type of, it might be kind of like an unconscious strong memory rather than one that you're consciously controlling. And that would be kind of supported by this pattern, actually. But
Shall we keep it here? All other questions for later? Okay.
Cool.
Thanks.
Thank you.